On the night of April 14, 1976, George Burns walked out onto the Tonight Show stage and did something no one in that studio had seen in 30 years of late-night television. He was not carrying a book. He was not carrying a prop. He was carrying something wrapped carefully in a cloth the color of old linen, held against his chest with one arm the way a man carries something he is not sure belongs to him. The audience applauded the moment they saw him. They always did. But George did not acknowledge the applause the way he usually did, with that slow half-turn and the cigar lifted slightly, the knowing expression of a man who has been getting this reaction for 60 years and still finds it mildly pleasant. Tonight he walked to the chair and set the cloth-wrapped object carefully beneath his seat before he even shook Johnny Carson's hand. And Johnny noticed. Johnny always noticed. What was under that chair, what George Burns had been carrying in the back seat of his car for 17 days, and had brought into this studio on this particular Tuesday evening for reasons that even his manager did not entirely understand, would produce the most completely silent 3 minutes in the history of The Tonight Show. You are not going to believe what George Burns said when Johnny finally asked about it. But before we get into that, there is something I want you to do right now. Every single week I receive messages in the comments from people who say they had no idea they were not subscribed to this channel. If you have been watching these stories, if you have found your way here more than once, please take 1 second right now and check that subscription. It is free. It does not cost you a single thing, and it is the most direct way you can help us keep making these stories for you. Thank you. Now let us go back to 1976. George Burns was 80 years old. He had just done something that had never happened before in the history of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. He had won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, his first Oscar. His first nomination, 80 years old, 60 years in the business, and this was the first time. There is a story inside that fact that almost no one in America knew, and that story did not begin in Hollywood. It did not begin on a film set, or at an awards ceremony, or in any of the rooms where careers are made and celebrated. It began in 1922, in a dressing room the size of a closet, in a theater in Newark, New Jersey, where a young comedian named Nathan Birnbaum, who had already failed in 23 consecutive vaudeville acts, and had recently borrowed $40 he was not certain he could repay, sat down across from a young man named Benjamin Kubelski, who was trying to figure out what to do with a violin in a world that did not especially want to hear him play it. Nathan Birnbaum would become George Burns. Benjamin Kubelski would become Jack Benny. But that night in Newark in 1922, they were simply two young men who did not yet know what they were going to be. They talked for 4 hours. They talked about timing, which is the thing every young comedian talks about because timing is the whole mystery, the thing you cannot teach and cannot learn, the thing that is either in you or is not. They talked about the specific weight of a silent audience, which both of them had experienced more times than they were comfortable admitting. They talked about material, about whether to steal, about what distinguishes stealing from influence. They did not reach any firm conclusions. But by the time they finished talking, something had been established between them that was different from the thing that usually gets established between two young men competing for the same rooms and the same bookings. What had been established was trust, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind you only recognize years later when you look back and try to identify the moment things became what they are. Burns and Benny did not become partners, at least not in any formal sense. They did not share billing. They did not build an act together. They went their separate ways and built their separate careers, Burns with Gracie Allen and the remarkable thing that happened when he became her straight man, Benny with his radio program and then his television show and the character he constructed over decades that was funnier the longer you knew it. But they talked. Every single morning for more than 50 years, George Burns called Jack Benny. Every morning, without exception. The calls did not have agendas. They did not organize business or coordinate schedules or plan appearances. They were simply the calls. Burns would later tell a journalist that they could last 3 minutes or 3 hours and that the length bore no relationship to the importance of what was said. What mattered was that the call happened. What mattered was that the morning began with a voice you knew all the way to the bottom of it, a voice that did not require you to perform, that did not need you to be George Burns in any of the ways that the world needed you to be George Burns. Jack Benny was the only person alive who had seen the whole thing. Every failure, every version of the act that had not worked, every night in every room in every city where the silence had come back at them both. He had seen Nathan Birnbaum before Nathan Birnbaum became anyone, and he had watched it all, every step of the transformation, with a particular attention and loyalty that Burns did not find anywhere else. This is the friendship that Johnny Carson asked George Burns about on the night of April 14th, 1976. This is the friendship at the center of everything that happened on that stage. And to understand what George said to Johnny that night, you have to understand what happened in the 2 years before it, starting in the summer of 1974. Neil Simon's play, The Sunshine Boys, had opened on Broadway in December of 1972. The story concerned two elderly vaudeville comedians, Lewis and Clark, long estranged after a professional partnership of many decades, who are persuaded to reunite for a television special. The play understood something specific and precise about the comedic mind, about the way old performers carry their craft as both a gift and a burden, about what it means to have built an entire identity out of making people laugh, and then to find yourself at the end of a life still doing it, still needing to do it, unsure of who you would be if you stopped. The night Burns finished reading the play, he called Jack Benny. He did not wait until morning. He called at 11 o'clock at night, which was not typical. Jack answered immediately. "I just finished it," Burns said. And Jack said, "I know, I was waiting for you to call. They talked about it for 2 hours. The play was in ways that required no analysis about them. Not literally, not in the plot, not in the specific facts of the characters' lives, but in the rhythm of it. In the particular frequency of the friendship between two men who had been in the business together for 50 years and carried all the specific love and irritation and unspoken history that implied. When MGM announced it was developing a film adaptation, Burns and Benny had already had the conversation about which of them would play Al Lewis, the quieter, more philosophical of the two roles, the one who had made a separate peace with his age in ways the other one had not. The role had Jack written into it in ways that went beyond the text. The director, Herbert Ross, agreed. By the summer of 1974, Jack Benny was attached to the project. Jack was 80 years old that summer, and he was more excited about a piece of material than he had been in years. Burns could hear it on the morning calls. Jack sounded young on those calls. Jack sounded like the man from Newark. He would talk about the role the way he had talked about the early years, with that particular quality of forward motion, of something good being just ahead. Burns listened to it and was genuinely, uncomplicated happy for him. This was the friend. This was what the friendship was. You wanted what your friend wanted to get, and you were happy when it was coming. Wait, you need to stop here, because what happened next was not supposed to happen, not to Jack Benny. Not in December of 1974, not without warning. Not on December 26th, the day after Christmas, when Burns was in Lowe's Angels and had spoken to Jack the day before, and Jack had sounded fine. A little tired. Tired was normal. 60 years of performing made a man tired at 80. The call came in the morning. Jack Benny had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer months earlier. He had declined to tell almost anyone. He had continued to make the morning calls every morning without letting on. He had known what was coming, and he had not said a word. He had not made it about himself. He had not asked for anything. He had simply continued to call and to talk and to be the voice at the beginning of the day, and then he was gone. George Burns sat down in the chair in his kitchen when the call came. He did not move for a very long time. Later, in the few contexts where he spoke about this at all, he said that the grief was enormous and total, and that he expected the grief. What he had not expected was the silence. The specific silence in the morning where the call had been. 52 years of mornings had been organized around the call. And now the morning came, and his hand reached for the phone and stopped. Burns said that his hand reached for the phone 6 more times that first week before it finally stopped going there on its own. 6 mornings of the hand starting the gesture and the mind catching it. 6 mornings of remembering. Then the hand stopped, and then there was just the morning. January passed, February came. Burns moved through the weeks with the particular efficiency of a man who has spent 60 years keeping engagements. He had commitments. He honored them. He performed. He was George Burns in every room that required him to be George Burns, but the calls had stopped, and the mornings had a different texture. In February of 1975, 3 weeks after Jack Benny's funeral, George Burns received a call from MGM. They explained their situation. Jack Benny had been attached to the project. Jack was gone. They needed to recast the role of Al Lewis. They wondered if George Burns would consider it. Burns said he would think about it. He hung up and sat with that question for 4 days, not with the question of whether he could do it. He was a comedian. He was a performer. He had been doing this since 1922, and he knew what he was capable of. The question was something different and harder. The question was whether taking the role of a man that Jack Benny had been going to play was tribute or trespass. Whether stepping into your dead friend's place was carrying something forward or taking something that was not yours. Whether it was honor or a particular kind of theft that happened between people who loved each other. He called Mary Benny. He told her about the offer. He told her precisely what he had been thinking, and he told her he would not take it if there was a single particle of hesitation in her. Mary listened to all of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "George, he would have wanted you to do it." And she said it in a way that was not comforting or encouraging. She said it in the flat, factual way that people say things that are simply true. Burns called MGM the next morning and said yes. What happened next has never been fully told until now, because what George Burns brought to the set of The Sunshine Boys was something that no director had asked for and no script had required. Every morning before filming began, Burns would arrive early, before the crew was fully assembled, before the lighting had been set, before Matthau or the director had come onto the set. He would sit in his chair in front of the cameras and he would be still for a while, not reviewing lines, not settling himself down in the professional way that experienced actors settle themselves. Something different from that, something private. The director, Herbert Ross, noticed it on the third day. He arrived early himself to find Burns already sitting. Ross watched him from the back of the set for a moment before making his presence known. He said later that what he saw was a man doing something you did not often see on a film set. Something that was not performance and was not preparation and was not rest. It was closer to what happens when someone is remembering something very carefully and trying to keep the memory exact. On the third week of shooting, after a scene that had required multiple takes, not because anything had gone wrong technically, but because what Burns was doing in the scene kept producing something that the crew did not entirely know what to do with, Ross took Burns aside. "George," Ross said quietly, "whatever you are doing when those cameras are running, do not change it." Burns looked at him. "I am thinking about my friend," he said. Ross nodded and did not ask anything else. Walter Matthau was one of the most gifted film actors of his generation. He was not easily moved by the work of other performers. He had seen too much and was too good himself to be easily impressed by someone else's craft. But he told an interviewer 2 years after the film was released that working with Burns on The Sunshine Boys had been unlike any working relationship he had experienced. He said Burns was not performing. He said there was a difference between performing and doing something else that he did not have a word for, and that Burns was doing the other thing. He said he had found himself, more than once, staying in his chair between takes because leaving felt wrong, like leaving during something. The Sunshine Boys was released in November of 1975 to the kind of reviews that alter the trajectory of a career. Critics reached for words they did not usually reach for. Revelation was one. So was found. The consensus was that George Burns had been there all along and that something about this particular role had made it impossible to look away from him. Burns read the reviews with characteristic dryness. He told his manager he wished they had felt this way in 1951. But something had shifted. Something about the film, about the role, about what he had brought to it, had cut through in a way that 60 years of exceptional comedy had not quite managed to do. In February of 1976, the Oscar nominations were announced. George Burns, Best Supporting Actor, The Sunshine Boys, his first nomination, 80 years old. He called his manager and said he needed a good suit and to get a table somewhere quiet after because he was not going to be in the mood for a party. March 29, 1976. The Dorothy Chandler Pavilion in Los Angeles, the 48th Academy Awards. Burns arrived early. He found his seat, declined a drink, and sat with the particular stillness of a man who has spent 60 years in front of audiences and has made a complete peace with whatever is about to happen. The other nominees in his category were outstanding actors and outstanding performances. He did not expect to win. He had prepared nothing. He was 80 years old at his first nomination, and he had prepared nothing because he had not expected to need it. Then his name was read. He stood slowly. He moved toward the stage at the pace he moved everywhere, which was deliberate and unhurried, and carried the particular authority of a man who has stopped caring what things look like in transit. He took the Oscar from the presenter's hands and he looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that the audience in the pavilion began to stir slightly, not with discomfort but with attention, because something about the way he was looking at it was not the way you looked at something you had just won. Then he said something into the microphone. He said what George Burns would say, which was brief and dry and got a laugh. And then he looked down at the Oscar again and said something else. Something quiet enough that the audience in the pavilion did not all catch it. Something that the microphone picked up and carried. "Jack," he said, "I think this one belongs to you." There was laughter from some quarters. There was silence from others. And then he walked off the stage with the Oscar held against his chest, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a man who had won. It was something harder to name than that. Here is what no one knew. Here is what the Tonight Show studio on April 14, 1976, fell completely silent to hear. George Burns did not go to the parties after the ceremony. His manager had confirmed 3 invitations, major parties, the kind where your absence is noticed and commented on and your presence would have been good for everything. Burns declined all of them in the car on the way from the pavilion. His manager tried to press the point. George, you just won the Academy Award. You cannot simply disappear. I will be at everything tomorrow, Burns said. There is somewhere I need to go tonight. His manager did not know where he went. His driver did. His driver took him to Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale. The driver parked at the gate and Burns said he would walk. He knew the way. He had been walking it every month for more than a year. He walked through the dark cemetery with the Oscar under his arm, and he found Jack Benny's grave, and he sat down in the grass. It was close to midnight. The grounds were empty in every direction. The city was below the hill, glittering and alive and entirely unaware. Burns set the Oscar in the grass beside the headstone. He looked at it. He thought about Newark. He thought about the dressing room in 1922 and 2 young men with nothing settled between them yet, and the 4-hour conversation, and the thing that had been established without either of them naming it. He thought about 52 years of morning calls. About the specific texture of Jack's voice on ordinary mornings when there was nothing to say except that the day had started and the call had happened, and that was enough. He thought about the summer of 1974 and Jack talking about the role with that quality of something good being just ahead. He sat there for a long time, and then he started to talk. He talked to Jack Benny for an hour. He did not feel foolish doing it. He had been talking to Jack his whole life, and this was not different enough to feel strange. He told Jack that the role was his. He told him that the reviews should have been his. He told him that every moment on set when Ross had told him not to change what he was doing, what he had been doing was thinking about Jack, and that the thinking about Jack was the whole performance, and that Jack should know that. He told him that he had not decided what to do with the Oscar yet because it did not feel like his to keep, and he could not figure out who else to give it to. And then he said something he had not planned to say. He said that every morning when his hand started to reach for the phone and then stopped, he went back to Newark. He went back to 1922 and the dressing room and the 2 young men who did not know yet what they were going to become. And he said that whatever he had become it differently because Jack had been there at the beginning to see it, and that being seen at the beginning by someone who stayed until the end was something he did not have a sufficient word for. He picked up the Oscar. He held it for a moment. He put it back in the grass. Then he picked it up again and carried it back to the car. He had still not decided what to do with it. He put it in the back seat. It stayed there for 17 days. He told this story on The Tonight Show on April 14, 1976. He did not plan to tell it. The conversation had been going well in the way Tonight Show conversations with George Burns always went well, which was warmly, and with a great deal of laughter, and the particular pleasure of watching a man who had been doing this for 60 years do it with perfect effortlessness. Johnny had asked about the film. He had asked about the Oscar. He had asked about the role and about working with Matthau and about what it felt like to win at 80. Burns had answered all of it with the precision and wit that made him the specific kind of treasure he was, and then Johnny leaned forward. He had a way of leaning forward that signaled something was changing, that the warmth was still there, but the next question was going to be the real one. George, he said, where did you go after the ceremony? Burns did not answer immediately. He reached below the chair. He lifted the cloth-wrapped object onto his lap. He folded back the cloth. The Oscar was underneath it. 300 people in that studio who had been laughing for the better part of an hour went quiet in the specific way that a room goes quiet when the thing happening in front of them changes categories. Johnny looked at the Oscar. Why did you bring it here tonight? He said. Burns looked at the Oscar, then at Johnny. I brought it because I have been trying to decide what to do with it for 17 days, he said, and I thought if I brought it here and talked about it out loud in front of people, maybe I would figure it out. Johnny waited. Burns turned the Oscar slightly in his hands. It is not mine to keep, he said, and it is not mine to simply give away. And I have been driving it around in the back of my car because I do not know where it goes. What do you mean it is not yours? Johnny said quietly. His voice was different from the voice he used for most questions. Burns looked at the audience. You know, he said, I did about 23 acts before I was any good. 23 acts. Different partners, different material, different versions of what I thought being funny meant. Every single one of them failed. He paused. There was a night in Newark in 1922 when I was 26 years old and I was sitting across from Jack Benny and we talked for 4 hours about timing. About silence, about what it meant to go out there every night and try. He set the Oscar carefully on Johnny's desk. The studio was perfectly silent. The whole audience of 300 people was perfectly silent. "This is Jack's Oscar," Burns said. He was going to play that role. He was excited about it in a way I had not heard him excited about something in years. He was going to be extraordinary in it. Johnny's jaw tightened. Burns continued. "When Jack died, they called me and asked if I would take the role. And I said yes, and I went out and I made the film. And every morning on that set, before the cameras rolled, I sat in my chair and I thought about Jack. Everything the director told me not to change. Everything the reviewers wrote about. It was Jack. I was thinking about Jack and it came out of me and it looked like a performance. But it was not a performance, it was a memory." Johnny Carson reached out and placed his hand over Burns' hand. He did not say anything. The studio was silent. This was the particular silence that descends when something true has been said in public. Not dramatically true in the way television truth usually works. Actually true. The kind that has no punchline waiting behind it and no resolution that arrives cleanly. Just true the way things are true when there is no reason to perform them because you are too tired and too old and the friend is already gone. After a long moment, Johnny said, "Where does it go, George?" Burns looked at the Oscar on the desk. "I'm going to give it to Mary," he said, "Jack's wife. I'm going to send it to her house and I am going to tell her that it was his and that it has just been on a brief excursion." Johnny nodded. "That is where it belongs," he said. Burns looked at the audience. He had a way of looking at an audience that was different from most performers. Most performers look at an audience and assess it. Burns looked at an audience the way a man looks at something that has been with him a long time and that he is genuinely glad to see. "You know the thing about Jack," Burns said, and his voice had a different quality than it had carried all evening, was that he was never interested in being famous. He was interested in being good. Every morning on those calls, everything we talked about was the work, whether the bit landed, whether the timing was right, whether what he did last night was better than what he did the week before. That was the whole ambition. Just be a little better tomorrow than you were today. He looked at the Oscar on the desk. "I think I learned that from him," Burns said. "I think everything I have done that was actually worth doing came from that. And I think learning that from him across 50 years of morning calls is worth more than any award anyone has ever given me." And then he looked up at Johnny and said, "Do you have any bourbon back here, or do I have to keep being sincere?" The studio erupted. 300 people releasing 3 minutes of held breath in the only way that felt right. Laughing and crying at the same time. Johnny laughing and reaching for the Burns arm. That particular mixture of genuine feeling and genuine relief that only happens when someone has been honest in public and then given everyone permission to breathe again. The broadcast ran 16 minutes over its scheduled runtime. NBC did not cut it short. The control room let it go. The broadcast went out that evening, and by midnight the switchboard was overwhelmed. Not with calls about the Sunshine Boys, not with calls about the Oscar, with calls about the person at the beginning, the person who saw the whole thing, the person whose voice had organized the mornings and was now gone. People calling to say they had someone like that and to thank the channel for the reminder. People calling to say they used to have someone like that and to describe the silence where the calls had been. Veterans calling to say they understood what Burns meant about the mornings. Men calling, which was unusual because men did not often call about things like this. 3 weeks after the broadcast, Mary Benny received a package. Inside, it was the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor from the 48th Academy Awards. Inside, it was also a handwritten note from George Burns. The note was 2 sentences. The first sentence said that the award had always belonged to Jack. The second sentence said that it had been a genuine honor to borrow it for a while and that he hoped it was no worse for the excursion. The Oscar lived in the Benny household for the rest of Mary's life. George Burns went on to perform for 20 more years. He did not retire at 80. He did not retire at 90. He had bookings confirmed through his 100th birthday, and he honored everyone he was physically able to honor. He would say in public interviews that he did not know any other way to be. That stopping was not in his vocabulary. That stopping would require him to figure out who he was when he was not performing, and that at this point in his life he did not have the time to figure that out. But in private, in conversations where the professional George Burns had been set aside, he would say something slightly different. He would say that every night before he walked onto a stage, he thought about Jack. He thought about 2 young men in a dressing room in Newark who did not know yet what they were going to become. He thought about what it meant to go out there and try. And he told himself that as long as he was still going out there, still trying, still landing the bit, Jack was still there too. In the only sense that mattered. The sense that is not nothing and is not nothing even when you cannot quite put it into a sentence. Before we go, I want to ask you something. This channel exists because of you. It exists because people watch these stories and feel something real and come back again. If you want to help us keep making them, consider joining the Johnny Carson Files community. There is a join button directly below this video. Members get early access to new episodes, behind-the-scenes content, and the knowledge that they are part of something built with genuine care for these stories. If joining is not possible right now, the subscription is free, and it means more than you know. George Burns lived to be 100 years old. He passed away on March 9, 1996, 9 days after his birthday. He had cigars with him at the end, which was fitting. He had been carrying a cigar since 1922, and it seemed right that it was there at the finish. In his final interview, conducted at his home in the last weeks of his life, the reporter asked what he wanted people to remember about his career. Burns was quiet for a moment. "I want them to remember that I had a friend," he said, "and I want them to understand that that is the career. That is the whole thing. Everything else is just material. If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think about the person who was there at the beginning, the one who saw you before you became whoever it is you became, the one whose voice organized the mornings, the one who does not need you to perform. Call them. You do not need an Oscar or a grave or a television studio. You just need to make the call, because somewhere right now there is a person whose hand still reaches for the phone out of habit, and the phone is not ringing. And the morning has a different texture, and they would give back every award and every applause and every good review that ever came their way to hear that voice one more time. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from, and if you have a Jack Benny in your life, tell us about them. Let us remember them here together.